guys, it's Alex and I'm here with another top 5 video. This week I decided to go with my top 5 underrated YA books. I read YA for a very long time. It was my biggest genre, and I was a big fan of picking up young adult books randomly instead of reading what was hyped, so I've read a lot that aren't necessarily the most well known. And for this list I went with underrated as I've seen on BookTube, which doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't popular books, it just means I haven't seen them mentioned much or at all on BookTube, and I do feel like they deserve more attention than they get. The first book on this list is one that I've mentioned numerous times. I absolutely love this book and this series, and it is The Books of Pelennor by Alison Croghan. There are 4 books in this series, this is the first one, and they are one of the most highly underrated young adult fantasy books that I've ever come across. I was not a big fantasy reader, but these books drew me in so much. I adored this series. I was so addicted to them, and I've only ever seen one other booktuber talk about them. I'm sure it's in part because they are fairly older in terms of the community. I think the last one came out just under a decade ago, but they're so wonderful. They're a high fantasy series that center around Mayrad, who's a teenage girl who's also the subject of a prophecy, and her teacher Cadvan, and it follows their adventures as they attempt to defeat the Nameless One. It does hit a lot of the typical high fantasy chosen one tropes, but it's so well written and so lovely, and the world is incredibly well developed that I just love this series. I loved it so much that when the 4th book came out in Australia several months earlier than it came out in America, I actually ordered it from Australia, so I have the Australian copy sitting on my shelf. And I'm not someone who usually pre-orders books, but I love this series and I would highly recommend it to anyone who likes young adult fantasy. The next book on this list is Not Otherwise Specified by Hannah Moskowitz. This is a YA contemporary about a bisexual black girl who also has an eating disorder, and it's funny. It does deal a lot with biphobia and her eating disorder, which is EDNOS. But it deals with all these things so well, and none of them are the focus of the story. They're just aspects of her life. The focus of the story is her dancing and her wanting to be involved in theater and maybe join a dance company. And that's the plot. That's what drives the story. Everything else is just background, but it's all so well done. I absolutely love this book, and it's one of the best eating disorder books I've ever read, and just one of the best books in general. I gave it 5 stars, and it was a book that I read it all the way through for the first time, put it down, and then just immediately picked it up and read it again. I think I read it twice in the same week because it was so good and just such a breath of fresh air. It's one of my favorite young adult contemporary books. And next is a book I have talked about recently on this channel and actually read in August, and that is One of Those Hideous Books Where the Mother Dies by Sonia Sones. This is a young adult contemporary novel written in verse about a girl whose mother has died and she has to go to California to live with her absentee movie star father. It's so sad and so funny and just such a real book, which sounds ridiculous since the plot sounds silly, but there's so much about this book that just is real. The voice sounds like a typical bratty 15-year-old who's going through a tough time, but in a charming way. This is a book I always pick up whenever I'm in a reading slump or a bad mood and just need something quick to get through because it is fairly short and it is written in verse. And I've only seen one other person mention that they've read this, but I love it so much and I would love for other people to read this and also love it because it's just a book that means so much to me. And I have Teach Me by R.A. Nelson, which is a contemporary about a teenage girl who has an affair with her teacher. I know that's not for everyone and it does deal with sensitive subjects, but the complexities in this book are so well done. Every character is incredibly well developed. Despite there being a lot of people who do make incredibly poor decisions, there's not a villain. Her teacher is a fairly terrible human being, but he's not the villain of the book. He's just a person who happens to be terrible. A lot of the book centers around Nine, who is the main character, as she sort of deals with her own personal issues. This book was so amazing that I honestly don't read any of R.A. Nelson's books anymore because the second book I read just couldn't live up, and I didn't want to read something that wasn't as amazingly well written as this one was. I loved this book. It meant so much to me in high school, and it was just a book that really touched me. I haven't seen anyone talk about it possibly ever, and I don't really know how famous it is, but it's one that I loved, and I would highly recommend to people who like young adult contemporaries that deal with more sensitive subjects. And finally, on this list, of course, we have The President's Daughter by Ellen Emerson White and that whole series. I love this series. It's probably one of my favorite series of all time, right up there with Harry Potter. I've read this book so many times, and it's an 800-page book. Like, this book is incredibly worn and creased, and it got that way not because I abused it once, but because I read it again and again. And it's like an 800-page book. It's also a young adult contemporary, although this book does get more into new adult, but the first three are young adult contemporary, about a girl whose mother is the president, and if that doesn't sound awesome, just right there without knowing anything else. They do get a lot more into serious issues as the books go along. The first is more of like a typical, her mother is the first female president, and she's sort of dealing with the media coverage and the fame. But as they go along, they get a lot darker. At one point she is kidnapped by terrorists, and she has to deal with a lot of PTSD and media issues, and it's so incredibly well written. Meg is a fantastic character. Her sense of humor is incredibly dry and witty. She's so smart. These books in general are just really intelligent, and I adore them so much. This is one of my favorite series, and it absolutely breaks my heart that people don't read it enough, because it deserves to be read more than it is. And I talk about it like at least twice a month, and I'm gonna keep talking about it until like everyone's read it, because it means that much to me. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and the series overall is just absolutely wonderful. It sounds like a kind of absurdist premise, which it is to a degree, but it's written in such a real way. If you like real contemporaries that deal with a lot of incredibly realistic characters and situations and feelings, I would highly recommend this. It's so well done. If you want YA that's a little bit older, Meg is 19-20 in this book and in college. She starts the series in high school and gets older as they go along. Would highly recommend. If you like reading in general, I would highly recommend. Ellen Emerson White is just a fantastic writer, and I would love for literally everyone to have these books brighten their life. Let me know down below what some of your favorite underrated young adult books are. It's such a popular genre on BookTube, but I feel like a lot of books tend to fall through the cracks despite them being absolutely wonderful. So I'm always looking for more recs for them. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye!